Good morning, Michael.
Hey, good morning, Eric. How are you, sir?
I want to call to order meeting of the Governance Policy and Advocacy Committee for May 12th. Roll call, please.
Chair Brown,
Here.
Vice Chair Cole,
Present.
Dr. Pierce,
Present.
Joellen Klein,
Present.
Francis Beasley, Kelsey Ellingson, here, Jared Holt, Emily White.
Here.
Chair Brown, we have a quorum.
Wonderful. Thank you. First up is the minutes. Anybody want to move approval of the minutes?
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Without objection, minutes are approved. What we're going to be addressing this morning are several items. We've got two relatively short policies for review and possibly recommendation to the board. And then we will have a discussion about is the committee next, or is the about the policy approach, or about equity?
Equity, the equity.
We're doing
update will be
equity.
next.
Okay, so we'll have a discussion on the equity policy. And then we'll talk about the direction of our committee. So first up is policy 0131. This pertains to, is this a bylaw or is this a?
This is a bylaw.
This is a bylaw. And it's just about the process for us to review policies and present them to the board, and then for the board to adoption. There's a few minor revisions.
Correct.
Any background?
We took a look at this bylaw mainly for the purpose of looking into first readings and second readings with regard to adopting, amending, or repealing a policy or bylaw. In the existing bylaw, it indicates that essentially we shall have a second reading unless an emergency of sorts exists. An emergency is also defined in the bylaw, and it is a fairly high standard. Because a second reading is not technically required by law, we wanted to provide update this policy to provide the board with more flexibility around this topic, so that if a further review is considered needed on a policy, the board may review it at a subsequent meeting, but that is not absolutely required. That is the first piece of what we're changing on this policy. Are there any questions about that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the thought here is that we're allowing ourselves from a policy standpoint to just be able to give a second look. This is about being thorough. Yes.
This.
Yes.
Chair
Yeah. It's about being thorough for the board to have an opportunity for a second reading.
Mhm.
Or if it's simple, straightforward, and we want to adopt it, we
We
can
can
simply
waive.
do that, even in the absence of an emergency to do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Any further questions on that piece of the change? Okay, the second portion towards the bottom of the bylaw indicates that generally speaking, policy amendment or an adoption is effective as of the date of the adoption by the board, but it allows for a situation where you can have it become effective on a different date, maybe a later date. We do have notations within our manual that do indicate that kind of situation where you have an adoption date, and then towards the bottom of the policy or bylaw, you'll see that the effective date is in fact different. Currently, that appears to be a little confusing. So we wanted to add language to this bylaw that kind of explains that and makes it appropriate for our manual. So this is really just a cleanup item. Any questions on that?
Questions on anything? Any comment?
Mr. Chair, this is Joellen. I just want to be clear. This is a policy. This is not a bylaw, correct?
No, this is a bylaw. I believe,
This is a bylaw.
yes.
I mean, so since when do bylaws come before this committee?
We've had bylaws here before. It requires a super majority of the board, I think,
Yes, it
to
does.
pass a bylaw. So it's still coming before the board with
Correct.
fairly high standards, but it's been the practice of the committee to review and offer suggestions on bylaws.
Vice Chair Cole, did you have a question?
No, I was just actually agreeing with Chair Brown that it's an opportunity for community inclusion. It might seem a bit unorthodox, but again, because full decision is really ours, as Eric just alluded, it's the opportunity to just get some additional weigh in. That's it.
Joellen, anything more?
Nope. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I'll just add that I definitely get the vein in which Joe, committee member Joel Klein addressed or asked the question in terms of the bylaw coming to this committee. Very interesting.
Okay. Do we have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second?
I'll
Any-
second.
Thank you. Roll call, please.
Chair Brown,
Yes.
Vice Chair Cole,
Yes.
Dr. Pierce,
Yes.
Joellen Klein.
Aye.
Francis Beasley. Kelsey Ellingson. Ellingson.
Yes.
Excuse me. And Emily White.
Yes.
Great, thank you all. The next policy we have is 6600. This pertains to the deposit of public funds and cash collection points for the district. You have some background, Kyle?
I was going to ask Mr. Eric Roush to speak on this policy.
From our finance committee,
Yeah.
our finance office.
Yes. And I go to the finance committees as well, so you were correct in both. There are a couple of changes here to this particular policy. The first is essentially, and this is recommended in the old language, we're not going to give cash back. You're not going to write us a check. You're not going to give us, give us your card. We're going to hand you cash back. This is also important because we're starting to move more and more cashless as a district. The second is a grammatical change. We just need that ED at the end of the term. The third specifies that essentially, as we're talking about cash collection points, that also includes other district buildings and locations, such as our downtown 270 location, this location. And then finally, perhaps one of the more substantive changes is essentially saying that the safes that we have in our buildings are an extension of the treasurer's office. And part of this is in order to comply with section 938, 9.3 of the revised code, which says you have to have a deposit, has to be either in a depository bank or on hand with the fiscal officer, in this case, our school district treasurer, within 24 hours for $1,000 or more, and for lesser amounts within 3 days. It's becoming more challenging to get armored car pickups, A, and B, as we're taking more and more cash out of the building, there comes a point in time, I was looking, just looked at a few schools. There are a few schools where actually the amount of cash they've had this year actually is we're spending more in regard to pickup for them to come and get that cash. And so there comes a point in time where we want to be able to perhaps change that frequency so that it's actually a better use of district funds while still complying with the statute.
Very good. Anybody have questions? Michael?
Thank you, Chair Brown. So I go to a football game where we still may very well be able to accept cash.
Not doing cash at
Not
sporting
doing
events.
cash at the
We're
sporting
not doing
events
cash at
anymore.
sporting events
So
anymore.
that's right, we're ordering the tickets in advance
Correct,
or we're paying by card at the venue.
correct.
Okay. So there's no instance where we would give $10 for something that was $7.30 and, you know, get $2.70 back and change.
We have made a provision should the system go down. So there's always that possibility. So we try to, this is that scout kind of be prepared mentality that I exist with sometimes. We do have, if the system went down, we do still have the ability to give change. We got a change fund and such to be able to operate and take cash if needed. But we really moved in the last year to remove as much cash as possible from the buildings. I think we're seeing a lot of success with that. But there's still some instances, we actually have a Lean Six Sigma project going on right now to identify what are those remaining things where cash is being exchanged. This is designed mostly, especially in these more rarefied circumstances, to ensure that we're in compliance with the revised code and avoiding the audit findings which come along with that. By stating that, by putting the cash in our secure safe, that it's on deposit with the treasurer. It's on deposit with our office, and then we have policies and procedures as far as the counting of that cash and putting together the books.
So in summation, I mean, it's ideal for us to have as little cash as possible. So we fall under that $1,000 piece
Correct.
that doesn't hold us to what is statutory.
It's
And then
ideal
we
to
don't
have little
continue to
cash
get
deposit
dinged on
period.
this in audit.
Yes, and it's a lower risk if we don't have cash on hand.
Got you. I just want to make sure that this cash back
We're not doing cash back at all. So the cash back is a check or a credit card. If I
Gotcha.
hand you a $10 bill, that doesn't apply.
Thank
If
you.
I
I
give
just
you
wanted
my-
to know.
sorry.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's still early, I apologize.
No, you're good. You're good. You're
But
good.
that-
I
yeah, that
appreciate it.
first provision, I can't give you my debit card and say, give me 20 back. That prohibits that. That's just good practice.
Absolutely.
So we're not a bank.
No, thank you. I just wanted to clarify that folks who did use cash would get their change
In the
back.
rare instances we do cash, yes, you'll get cash back.
Okay,
Cash for
awesome.
cash.
Thank you.
Question.
Yes.
I know at the city, we have similar, we're bound by similar restrictions, and I know also that the service, you can, what's the service you've been using? I forget.
Guard is our current bank.
Guard, yeah, it can be a really difficult partnership. But this is creative, and I'm just curious, who else is taking this approach?
I'm unaware of anyone else who's taken this direct approach. We did run this by legal and they didn't tell us no. So they indicated, okay, it's not prohibited. So it is a little bit of creative approach. I'm trying to think where I've seen this. I've seen or read about this somewhere else. It wasn't just there was an informed idea when this came about in my head when we had the initial conversation about it, or when we discussed it, but I'm not aware of any places directly doing this at this time. We could be the first, a trendsetter, if you will.
Yeah, interesting. And so then, follow-up question, Chair. What are the limits on who can be a designee of the treasurer's office?
That would fall to the treasurer to identify how many designees that individual wishes to have. So
Do you have any ideas about, several follow-ups, Chair? Do you have any idea about who in practice would be likely to be a designee?
well, we have staff, we have area treasurers who go from building to building. So obviously they're designated as employees of the office. More than likely, as we start to put together the refinement of our policies and procedures, currently the principals of the buildings are responsible for their safes. So they would then in turn also be able to
Okay.
act in that manner. And again, by making the safe an extension of our office, then it is on file and deposit with our office.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Wonderful.
Sharon, I have a question. So is this policy then going to leave more than $1,000 in cash in possibly in buildings throughout the district? Does that raise any additional security concerns?
It will, the money doesn't live there in perpetuity. All that means is that we can reduce our particular armored truck runs until we actually have a little bit more bandwidth to come and make the pickup. We believe that the safes are secure. Again, I'm spending $38 to pick up 20 sometimes, and
Correct.
that doesn't make sense. And so it's kind of that cost benefit analysis that we ran and looked at and felt this was probably a more prudent use of district resources while still securing the funds.
But is there,
Well,
if I may ask a quick follow-up though, if I appreciate how $1,000 is probably less money than it was maybe when this policy was passed, but is there some other threshold that would raise those security concerns where the $38 would be worth it not to have $10,000 in cash sitting around, for instance?
So the thing is, the key element, the key common denominator to all of this is timing. It's really timing. So the $1,000 limit piece gives us the opportunity to make sure the money gets to where it's supposed to be within 3 days. Anything higher than that requires a 24-hour turnaround. So the security aspect of this is incredibly limited just based on the timing aspect of when this money has to be deposited, if I'm making any sense. Eric, if you want to build on that.
You laid that out beautifully. Additionally, as we're taking more and more cash out of buildings, there's gonna be less cash that we have to worry about. So we're not gonna have that. We're gonna stay below that $1,000 threshold. This allows us to still pick it up in a timely manner. It's not as if we're doing away with it entirely. It just enables us to be more frugal, more prudent, get the cash picked up without running afoul of that 3-day rule. So you could do it once a week instead. Because right now, you're outside the statutory boundaries.
But with this rule, if each safe is designated as a part of the treasurer's office, then under this rule, potentially the cash could sit there forever. It wouldn't have to move back to a different place like it would before this revision, correct?
It just means what we're doing here is ensuring that we're in compliance with the revised code section. We still have to pick up the cash. It's not going to live there forever. I can promise you that's not going to occur. It just keeps us in compliance that we have the funds in our control and the funds are on deposit with us because by virtue of the fact that they're in that safe. We're still going to run the Garter runs. It just means that we can do it less frequently than multiple times a week to try to pick up cash.
We're not losing money in the exchange.
Yeah, I'm just concerned given, I mean, we still have lots of bank robberies in our community, for instance. I just hate the idea of a school building itself. You know, even if a limited number of people might know the cash is there, if they know that potentially raises security risks. The bigger the amount, the more the risk.
Michael?
No.
The reality is that there are times where Garda doesn't pick cash up now, and because it's a challenge with the vendor, and they're short drivers as well. I think Ms. Ellenson noted that the city sometimes has similar challenges with that. All we're trying to do is find a way to comply with the statutory provisions and avoid any kind of audit citations, while still also acting in a I think a very prudent manner from a financial standpoint. So we're still getting cash out of the buildings. The alternative would be, in order to comply with this, if we miss a Garda pickup, if Garda doesn't come, and I know other districts do this, they give money to their secretaries and send them output to the bank. That is something we do not wish to do. We don't want to do that. That's something other districts do. But I think that this is a way to comply with our statutory legal obligations, avoid those kind of audit citations, while being very business minded on how we approach this, with minimizing that risk, because we're reducing that cash to such a little amount in the building we'll be able to kind of spread those pickups out to a much greater extent.
I think what Ms. White is really alluding to in her concerns is just safety and security overall. So it's not even so much just about where the money is settled. It's the fact that money is there, and that being the antecedent that the consequence could possibly be higher risk of somebody trying to come into the building and take it. We have safety and security in the buildings all throughout the district. I'm sure that there are lockdown processes for where these dollars are kept that would otherwise really be petty cash. I mean, for all intensive purposes. But so again, to Eric's piece, he's right on point with, we're trying to make sure that this falls within state compliance, but more importantly, to your concern, we do have safety and security in the building to, ensure not only the safety of our children, but staff and the asset itself.
And again, if for some reason we had an influx of cash, we have the ability to order special pickups from Guard. So if you had that rare occurrence where, as you mentioned, $10,000 came in, they'd be there the next day to pick that up. We'd have them there for that. If it wasn't a regular pickup, we have the ability to make that call.
Anything more? Any other questions from anybody? Not, do we have a motion to approve this policy?
So moved.
Second.
Second.
Roll call, please.
Chair Brown,
Yes.
Vice Chair Cole,
Yes.
Dr. Pierce,
Yes.
Joellen Klein,
Aye.
Kelsey Ellingson,
Yes.
Emily White,
Yes.
Motion's passed. This will be, all of these will be recommended to the board. Next up, we've got two matters to discuss. First is the equity policy. And to help us with that discussion, we've got a professional, Dr. Danielle Blue, who I've met in person for the first time this morning. But she's been working on this with a team of people. Where are we?
Thank you, Chair Brown. So good morning, everyone.
Morning.
So I wanted to say first that I apologize for us not having the policy ready for you to actually review today. There's been some capacity issues in my department, so we were running just a bit behind, but we will be ready for your review at your June meeting, 100% for sure. But the update on the policy is that we've vetted it across our cabinet members, as well as a couple of more national organizations that focus on equity, just to be able to think about how do we pare down the language in a way that it's cleaner and more concise about what the board commitment is and what the board will do related to equity. So one of the biggest things that came out of those discussions, in terms of, just for you all to know, is that the previous version, we talked to the board and earlier in the winter about a draft that had been previously drafted but never at that time come before the board or come before this committee to take to the board. We wanted the committee created a draft that they wanted to wait until the equity department was in place before we finalized, and so that's where we were. But one of the pieces that was missing, based on where we are now in terms of our board goals and guardrails and strategic priority areas, is to expand the focus of the policy to not just students and student achievement, but also staff and systems. And so trying to be as inclusive as possible to think about equity at a systems and governance level. And so we made some revisions to the policy to reflect that, and kind of reduce some of the language that might not necessarily be policy language, so that there's no question as to what the actual commitment from the board is. So I think that it'll be a good conversation next month. It's definitely shorter than it was, but I think it hits home where it needs to be. And some of the pieces that had been there, we can move to other places like the administrative guidelines, or in some cases, student handbook, something like that in terms of board commitments and things like that. So that's kind of where we are, and the goal is to have it approved by the start of school. So I'm hoping that we're still on a good trajectory to do that in terms of having it ready for the start of school. But other than that, we just want to make sure that we've crossed all the T's and dotted the I's. So I think we're almost there in terms of being able to have discussion with you all about it, present to you.
Sounds good. Obviously, part of the reason this is on the agenda is this was our original target, but more important is to remind everybody that this is still out there and it's a policy that we really want to get into place. And it's important. So please try to make it at next month's meeting.
Chair Brown, I have a question.
Yes.
And it's really a point of clarification. So I just want to clarify, our committee actually passed that piece of the policy. We passed that, I want to say, very early on in 2020 and sent it to the board. The board then sent it to Dr. Blue for administrative guidelines, suggestions, and review. So I just want us, when we come back to our next meeting, to be very clear on what has happened and what those next steps were intended to be. So this coming back at the next meeting should be the recommendations, the feedback from Dr. Blue based upon the board sending the policy to her equity office.
Michael.
That begs a question. Thank you, Dr. Pierce. That just begs a question. So it's given her comment, I mean, your thought, your process on this is what in articulating that you went through an additional process. I'm questioning, I'm asking,
Yes.
Not putting anything in your mouth,
Mhm.
but you went through an additional process
Yes.
of identifying other systemic areas where this policy needs to have impact. Bless you.
Yes, correct. Because the way the policy is currently written, the focus is student achievement. And still being new, one of the things I have learned is that we have policies, a set of policies that are kind of student facing, and a set of policies that are more our adult facing policies, whereas we want this policy to go across that. So there's not two separate policies, one that applies to the adults, one that applies, or, to employees, and one that applies to students and student achievement. We wanted to have something that is more comprehensive and at the systemic level, so that it applies to the student experience and as well as the experience our adults are having related to equity.
Okay. And just in the interim, how has your office, I think this would be something that would be helpful to, allude to as well.
Sure.
How has your office help the organization behave equitably? How has your office aided that process in our behavior in the interim of when we gave you our policy, our version, up to the point that we'll finally approve it?
Mhm.
How has your office helped us behave equitably or better?
Okay, in terms of the district level, the district facing level, it has been in the form primarily of being a part of key conversations that impact students and adults. So whether that's ongoing meetings with HR about the way that we are doing our hiring process, really looking at kind of a more equitable way to do that, looking at staffing, being a part of the CEA negotiations committee, which is even though it's policy related, it still impacts behavior. In terms of other pieces at the more school facing level, I have done equity walkthroughs at some of the buildings and kind of helped them craft some goals for next year around equity for their building, as well as done professional development a lot and for either school faculties or groups of professionals around the district that directly touch the lives of students.
Okay, and anything with PD?
Yeah,
So
all of that.
there's some behavioral thing.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
I'm mentioning these things because again, I think it's incredibly important that folks know the breadth and depth of your influence, the
Mhm.
influence of your department.
Right,
Just the work of the negotiation piece on the collective bargaining side and your presence there is humongous in and of itself. So I just, we don't want this to turn into something it doesn't need to be, but
Mhm.
sometimes it helps you to be able to really give us a clear idea of what it is you deal with on a day-to-day
Mhm.
that influences our behavior, so
Right.
that we're clear that we didn't lose something in a gap. The
Right.
children and or our organization was not hurt as a result of it because we didn't
Right.
have an equity policy in place.
Absolutely,
Okay.
because the commitment is still there. The policy is just to make sure that in perpetuity, there's no question about what that means. But the other piece that some of our employees tend to want to see is what does our policy say about, X or Y related to how they should behave or what they should do related to some equity pieces. And so it would be that piece makes it helpful, but the commitment in terms of the work that we're doing in terms of PD that I've been doing and what we'll be creating for next year is absolutely in place.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Chair Brown, if I could just add that I want to, and I would hope that it wouldn't be framed as a referendum or a sign of the need of our equity policy by a connection to the time that it is taken for this equity policy to come before our committee and back to the board again. I think the main framing that we just need is that it is a referendum on our district and our district's action and commitment. I think our staff is showing that commitment. So I just want to reiterate again that the framing necessarily is, and I would hope that the framing is not seen as a referendum on Dr. Blue, her team, or any other administrator for that matter, but that it is kept very above level in terms of the commitment of the district and the board to ensuring that we have policy that is very clear on our commitment to equity.
Good. Très bon. Very good.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. I agree.
Yeah, that'll be fine. And, the board action on whatever recommendation this committee makes will be clean in terms of it's simply adoption of policy. I don't think the board is going to be doing any direct framing of anything other than to thank everybody who's worked on this and know that we've gotten to a good place. To a great extent, I'm hopeful that the policy will represent many of the things that we're already doing. So, thank you. Anybody else?
If I,
Member Emily White would like to speak, Chair Brown.
I saw that.
Thank you. If I may, I also participated in some of the subcommittees and the discussions and the drafting process on that policy. And I recall at the time, and still now, it seemed like we have broad community consensus on the importance of equity, the significance of equity, how much of a priority this is. One thing that we never quite hammered out, and I think this continued discussion is an opportunity to work on, is the process, not the commitment, not the words that we put in the policy, but like, what is the process for how we gather information and data and feedback from the community and other stakeholders on equity? How do we make sure that there's accountability, that we can both look back and see how we've been doing and look to the future and see what more we could be improved? And I would love to see more best practices, more processes. I remember that one of the reasons this policy was sort of put on hold was to not tie the district down to things that should really possibly be more sub-policy guidance. But there's still some parts of that accountability that need to be anchored in a policy. For instance, is there going to be an annual review of equity, or should it be on a longer scale or a shorter scale? What format does that look like? Is it a written report? Is it supported by data? How is it reported to the community? How is feedback obtained from the community? Because we all have experiences and data pieces and pictures of parts where equity is not where it should be. And I do appreciate you pulling in other stakeholders and members of the community and our staff as well, because that's an important piece of the puzzle. But I would just love to hear more concrete best practices there, and not on a let's seek out people and punish them, or let's have a way for people to make complaints. I would really love to see something that's more proactive and durable, and not something that you have to revisit only whenever there's a problem. That revisiting of those issues and that constant improvement should actually be built into the process. But I'm really glad that we're still chipping away at this.
Thank you, and I thank you for raising those questions. To some extent, I think that will be the topic of the next item on the agenda. It'll be a small part of what we're going to talk about for the committee going forward. But I think you're right that we need to do those things, Michael.
Oh, no, I agree, Chair Brown. In fact, one of the ways that we as a board have begun to really engage that answering those questions and making that demand is that we incorporated this into our goals and guardrails. Our goals, of course, are what we are asserting ourselves toward ultimately to impact student outcomes, right? The guardrails are the thou shalt nots on the part of the superintendent and administration that will not violate those goals or impede those goals. So we adopted a student outcome focused governance model that we are training and working in and constantly monitor these things. So monitoring will definitely be a part of the equity piece, because that is embedded in our goal process and our guardrail process. So, but to your argument, to your case made earlier and today, I do still think that there should be something that we are making sure that there's embedded language, some sort of way that says we're going to hold ourselves accountable to it. So I appreciate the thought too. But we in the interim have started this process.
And if I could
Could I just, on the comment that board member Cole just made, I think there might be an opportunity for our chair and our co-chair to provide our committee members with that monitoring schedule. So again, to committee member White's question, can we have more concrete information? For this committee to receive that concrete information, they would have to tune into a board meeting. And might we be more proactive to just provide this committee with that information, since the committee is focused on bringing the equity policy to our district and making sure that it's implemented with fidelity across the district for both staff and students. So as opposed to putting the commitment on the shoulders of the committee members to tune into our board meetings, that on our leadership end, we're more proactive. We provide that monitoring schedule. We provide an update as to how those thou shall not guardrails are guiding the equity work in the district.
Here, here.
I'm sorry if I could just follow up quickly. I don't perceive us as being the ones who provide equity answers. I'm just saying that whatever the process is that is embedded within this equity policy should make sure that there's data collection responsiveness. I love the idea of braiding it into the processes that the board is already adopting, which actually came after the discussions in the initial drafting of this equity policy. Having those all be in alignment makes perfect sense. But I don't see this as a situation. You can't bring every single in perpetuity back to a policy committee. At some point, you just have to have that policy.
But I think to this point, committee member White, there's an information gap that is being exposed and having this conversation. And so the fact that we do have those guardrails that are guiding some of the equity work, and that information specifically has not been shared with the committee, I think this next meeting provides an update for information to be shared so that gap no longer exists, or that gap is decreased in some way.
That all sounds good from all of you. Thank you for your input. I'm glad that Dr. Blue's here with us to hear it for herself and to have an opportunity over the next month before the written documents provided to us for review to consider those matters and possibly work some in to the policy. There will be others that may be part of the process we're going to talk about next. And that is our direction. Anybody have anything else about this equity policy? Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm guessing that this will clearly be the most significant item on our agenda for the next meeting, perhaps the only item.
Equity.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, we'll have to see how that ends up.
Yeah.
But it's going to be an important discussion. And finally, we have a discussion that Kyle will lead us, talking about the direction for this policy committee and the policy work of the school board.
Yes, I'd like to thank Dr. Blue for being here today. Thanks so much for giving us that update. We have been looking into, I guess this is just a broad level discussion about the direction of policy. I will mention that I've heard a lot about policy diet. And we did have a meeting with Co-Chair Brown, Board Member Beckerly, James Barnes, and a few other folks to discuss this recently. And my goal of that meeting was just to get an overarching general idea of where we want to go with policy going forward. Part of what we discussed is kind of where we are, when the last time we updated our entire manual was, which was around 2015, how many policies we have in place currently, how many administrative guidelines we have in place, the fact that that administrative guideline project was never really completed. And in light of the policy diet idea, how we want to go forward. So I would like this, and Chair Brown was obviously in that meeting and can add to this. And I just want this to be a discussion and to give the committee an idea of kind of that we're talking about this, and that this committee is going to be charged with vetting that to some extent. Do you have anything to add, Chair Brown?
The other thing that drives this to some extent is the audit that was done several years back that talked about our having far too many policies, among other things. I don't recall the number that we currently have, but it is way too big. And the policy diet that we are getting as part of our new operational model is really strongly suggests that we limit policy to those things that are really school board policy, and that we might make much better use of the administrative guidelines where that's appropriate. It will also entail not just rearranging things, but really taking a hard look at the policies and making sure that they're clear and succinct and comply with code and are limited to those matters that the board must weigh in on or should weigh in.
Correct.
Thank you. So I ultimately, if I distill this, I see this as a change in our dogma, our idea and approach to policy as a district, as a board, right? I think that we've done quite a bit of work to maintain ourselves, particularly since 2015, 2014, actually, 2014. 2015 is where we kind of landed with a finalization of what we looked at in terms of our policies. We have a 9,000 series policy, 9,000 series. Anyone can go to our district website and take a look very comprehensively at what our policies are. I think that they are important. I don't believe in any way, shape, form, or fashion that they negate administrative guideline. I think they clearly establish exactly a framework necessary for the superintendent, treasurer, and internal auditor to perform their tasks. I think that there's considerable work that has been done on the part of this committee to ensure that we are performing omnibussly. So when the state legislature does something, we then follow suit by reforming our policy. I think that we've made some smart changes in terms of saying, well, maybe we don't have to be as redundant, right? We can always allude to what statutory law states, right? We don't have to repeat the whole thing that was revised because the state changed law. I think that we have performed and behaved responsibly, proactively in certain instances, and very tailor-made for Columbus City Schools in terms of what we value. So the whole point I'm making in this whole monologue, if you will, is that I think the way that we're going about this is the right way. We have community input. We have a very transparent and visible process. We have, we're transparent about what is actually policy and where it is located, how people can have access to it. I don't think that I think the confusion often becomes in how the administration thinks about how they want to do something. But us giving constant guideline to that and framework, I think we've done a good job in that. I don't know if I want to disturb the horse cart, so to speak, because we have a transparent, proactive, collective, collaborative process by which we do this work. So I don't, to me, it just seems this approach seems, and when I say this approach, because I don't want to, I'm not attacking. I don't want to seem like I'm attacking, understand? I just feel like a certain type of approach that is not what we're doing now could possibly be laissez-faire-ist, could be hands off. And I don't believe in hands off. I drive with both hands on the wheel. My steering wheel in my car is a little bit loose. So I drive with two hands on the steering wheel. And I think that this committee is driving with two hands on the steering wheel. I believe that this board is committed to driving with two hands on the steering wheel without being laissez-faire-ist. So that's just my feedback to that whole thing.
And my short response is that I think that what we spoke about the other day when we met and about the kinds of changes we're thinking of. One, it fits with our new governance process, especially the notion of paring down the policy book, having a policy diet. I think that makes a great deal of sense. And secondly, I think we're going to remain true to the values that you've just stated. I don't disagree with you about those values, but I think we do need some fresh look, and this will involve, work and decisions along the way. And obviously, at the end of that, we'll have your input throughout. And at the end of the process, the board will either adopt or not adopt the work product. There's some other questions, comments? Kyle, you want to?
I was looking, Ms. White, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I just want to say, having served on the committee for a few years now, I'm very comfortable, I guess, with the current level of regulation. This is an enormous, complex district. Many of the regulations and policies that we're looking at are required by law. So if it's not going to be written down somewhere, somebody else is either not going to have it, or they're going to be going alone. It just seems like there are so many benefits to having these as policies, having them adopted by the board, and having them in writing for all to see, as opposed to the alternative, which it seems is just going to be administrators either making the policy themselves or having their practices that are not as transparent. I'm very comfortable with it's a really complex district. It just is. And so the fact that you sometimes have to have a Title IX policy plus an equity policy, maybe it would be nice to have one, but life is complex, and a lot of these policies are tailored to that purpose. I would suggest, though, that if just the sheer length of them is the problem, maybe to continue doing what we've been doing, which is to have a sunsetting provision, a time period where, after 5 years or some different time period, you revisit that rule and say, is it still necessary? Does it still make sense? And continue the same practice that the committee has been doing of getting guidance from stakeholders who have actually been implementing these policies about what needs to change or not. But I think it would be very difficult to just throw it all out, or to rewrite it, or to put it on a diet, given how complex it is. And I guess the other thing that we all ask for every policy that comes up is, what is the problem to be solved here? And I guess with this proposal, I would ask the same thing. What is the problem to be solved by these rules being kind of long and complex, or you might say detailed and focused on specific scenarios that they were drafted to include? If there are large numbers of policies that don't match what they should, maybe they should be revised. If there are large policies that aren't being used, maybe we should look at culling those. But if we can't point to specific places where having fewer policies would help, then why change that when some of these policies, many of these policies are critical for very specific reasons, complying with law, maintaining eligibility for athletics, things like that. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Thank you. Todd, do you want to speak to that?
Well, first I want to mention that I haven't been here long, first of all, and I'm happy to be here. And since I've been here, I guess I've been trying to figure out exactly where we are, and things like Ms. White just mentioned, where are we in terms of compliance? Do we have policies that are out of date? Do we have policies that we need that we don't have? Do we have policies we have and we don't need? These are the kind of questions I've been asking. I came in with many more questions than answers, and I've been moving towards getting those answers. I don't really have I'm looking to the board and this committee to direct my work. There are, I do believe I've discovered there are all of those things I just discussed. There's policies that probably need to go away. There's new policy that needs to be added, like the equity policy. And there are policies I know right as we sit here today that need to be revised. So I've been looking at how to best approach that process while still hearing the board discussing a policy diet. So for my part, I'm more looking for guidance on how to best proceed to get us into the best position possible. I don't think it's my decision to decide how we get there. There are many options. One of the things, as a policy consultant previously for a policy provider, one of the things we recommended was essentially a whole rewrite of a manual every 5 years. That would be for like a typical district. This is a very large district. It would be a much more complex process and a heavier lift to do that, but it would provide an opportunity to go through the manual policy by policy, determine what is in fact required, and tailor it to our specific district needs. So that is one avenue that we can take that makes sure that we're touching on everything and we're not missing anything. And we end up with a good product. But again, I'm looking more for direction than offering the answer to that. So I'm mainly here to listen and take guidance and keep us from staying exactly where we are, but to get us moving. We have things like the PDK audit that came through. There's some critical things that we need to do to address that audit. So I see this as maybe we have some short-term goals while we have an overarching, larger idea, what way are we going with policy in general. So we're going to be moving policies. We're working on policies right now to address urgent needs, to address things that I know are out of date or need to be better reflected in policy. So we do have some immediate goals in that regard, but this conversation is more of a big picture, where are we going overall conversation.
Thank you. Yes, and Michael?
I love the question, Zero, that you asked Ms. White about what problem are we trying to solve? The theory in action for the policy diet piece, the theory is that we're solving the problem of board focus. The theory is that we're supposed to be more focused on student outcomes. So when we are hyper-focused in certain areas of policy in our governance, the idea is that there's a opportunity cost to that we're spending more time in one particular place and the other place that we need focus lacks it. And thus the idea is that student outcomes are negatively impacted as a result of that. But again, because of the complexity of our organization, all the things you just stated, I think that the track that we're on is a progressive one. Some of the things that you suggested, I think, are good suggestions about how we tighten that process and make it better. But I still am in the same place that we don't need to disturb the cart. We can make it better. We make the wheels better, but we don't have to disturb this in a way that, makes it laissez-faire-ist. But the question is answered by, you guys need to be more focused on outcomes for students than all the other operation stuff of your district. And what that theory fails to acknowledge, and I'll yell it from here to California, what the theory fails to acknowledge is that we are a government regulated entity, and we are a body politic who are beholden to that. We have to answer to that. We have to make our organization accountable to that. So we can't just be like, well, you handle it. Administrative guideline, fix it. We can't do it that way. We can't. So that's where I am.
Dr. Pierce.
Yes, I would. Thank you so much. So might it be helpful to level set this committee? In our meeting today, we have thrown around terms that some of our committee members may not be familiar with. When we are looking at our student outcome focused government or governance, that is a model that entails not just theory, but also actions that have implications for the work of this committee. And so we've kind of started a discussion without level setting and providing everyone on the committee with just basic information about what the theory is and how those theories are impacting the work that administration is doing and the work that committees will be doing, whether those are board committees or administrative committees. And so I think also when we talk about how do we move forward with various audits that have come through. So at this point, we do have our curriculum audit that has come through. What is the policy direction of that? We also have an athletic report that has come through. What are the policy implications of that? Our HR audits that have gone through, what are the policy recommendations related to that? And so I think before we can really have a a robust, a critical conversation about our policy direction, there needs to be a level set in which everybody has the information around our new governance model, the implications of that governance model, and then specifically drilling down to the implications of the governance model for this particular committee.
Makes sense. Do you have a suggestion for how we approach that, how we do that?
Yes, I think at our next meeting, we need to make a presentation that lays out what the new governance model is in terms of the goals and the guardrails. I think we also need to lay out the implications for a policy diet, and I would also say a committee diet, because that is the other thing that comes along with this governance model, is that you also start to pare down your committee and your committee structures. So I think we need to just be very transparent with this committee. I would hope with all of our committees that we're having this conversation. I don't think we can assume that people are watching board meetings or they're reading through the governance model and they understand the implications of this governance model, again, on the work that we're doing.
I understand that, and that makes sense. The next question for me would be who best to present that? The first person that comes to mind is AJ.
AJ did. So,
With this committee?
yes, sir. Absolutely. Now I'm happy to invite him back. So I believe it was the month that you were out of town that I chaired the committee. I invited AJ and his team to give a presentation of SOFG. You were there, you sat right next to me. SOFG to the entire committee. And he gave, I want to say, a 90-minute, up to almost a 90-minute presentation on exactly what SOFG was, what its foundation and premised on. Student outcomes don't change until adult behavior changes. He walked through that. Again, I'm more than happy, because I don't disagree with what Tina said. I think that what Dr. Pierce alluded to is great. Yeah, if we want to bring him back, he can walk through again what those value sets are from the standpoint by which we have identified, be it goals and guardrails. Okay, fine. But he did give a presentation that was quite thorough.
So I would say that part doesn't need to be as extensive as it was last time. I think the focus needs to be on where we are as a district, the goals, the guardrails, and the implications for that, for those values now on the work that is being done. So again, that could be a brief 10 minutes of here's what the governance model is, and here's where we are, needs to be the bigger portion of our overview, our level set.
And that's your side of it, Kyle. That's your side of it. What you know now as to where we are with what's been updated, where are we current in our policies, where do we have some measure of lag, and that could be categorized. I'm not trying to tell you how to do your job, but that could be categorized in levels of emergency. Color, green, yellow, red, however you want to do it. But to me, that would be a conversation I'd be led by you all.
If I can just jump in, I remember that conversation, I think it was in January, maybe.
Yeah.
I was inspired by it and I took a lot of good notes. So I think that there were a lot of lessons there, and it did sort of talk about trying to focus in on what your biggest goals are and not spread yourself too thin across things that you may not ultimately achieve. I can see that being a link to this current conversation, but I will just say as a participant, before your mention of that, what was discussed here did not feel like the same conversation. So it seems like there were more tactics related to the broad conversation he provided, or he walked us through, that we're now discussing here. So it would make sense to me why we didn't get that part of the presentation initially. But I was sitting here thinking, Dr. Pierce, that I would really benefit from a sort of foundational conversation about why we're having this conversation and what the different component parts are. For example, so policies and bylaws can be the board statement about what you're trying to do here and what the laws of the land are. But the flip side is where do people who are helping to run the ship go to for reference about how they should do their jobs? So I do think that there is, a rational extension, a logical extension of that is that some things they might be looking to administrative guidelines rather than policies. And maybe that's how, as a committee member, and as a participant, I've learned that we look to policy to express that. But if they're, as the practitioner, looking to a different place, communicating to them is the most important part. So I think there's a conversation worth having here about balancing all of these things. I have lots of questions and I look forward to it. Yes, so I just wanted to kind of bring that together from the committee member perspective.
Well, I think that we can arrange AJ if he turns out not to be available when we're next scheduled to meet. We can either try for the following month, or we may want to set this up as a special committee meeting at another time that does work. It'll never be ideal for everyone, but we'll do our best. The other person that I'd like to hear from at that meeting is Carol Beckerly. In part because Carol is not only very up to speed on the SOFG model, the student outcome focused governance model, but she also participated in the meeting with me and Kyle and James Barnes, and somebody else was there.
Terry Breeden.
Terry Breeden, that's right, about what we're looking at, what we're thinking about with respect to policy direction. So I think that, we can invite Carol as well to offer her thoughts. I think that, for today, we've, opened the door to this discussion, laid the groundwork, and set up a direction for us on how to proceed initially. And we'll continue to develop that as we go forward. Obviously, the next meeting will be primarily dealing with the equity policy. And we'll see how long that makes, but I'm sure we can make adequate time if AJ is available for at least to hear from him for a brief update. Because that'll be, because he's on Mountain Time, I think, 2 hours earlier. We may want to put him toward the end of our meeting if it happens next month. Any other thoughts about this subject, Emily?
Yeah, just a few more thoughts. It seems like there's if you're at a divergence between the board taking a very large step back from the policy and essentially delegating that to the administration to do, whether in writing or just simple practice, versus the board possibly rewriting all the policies to somehow be more lean. It seems like a third way might be to just set it, have a time to review the current policies, and at that time, sort of weed through them, consolidate them, and all of that. I still think, as I have for all of our policies, all of the first step should be somebody in the administration, not the board, people who are on the ground implementing these policies, to gather that information and wisdom from those who are actually implementing the policy, to find out what's working, what's not, and to still have an eye on what was the problem this was meant to solve. And I think that having some sort of report documenting that piece would help whoever's making the decision, either the committee or the administration, about whether that policy should stay, go, or be amended, would be really helpful. If you did it on like a 5-year schedule, every 5 years it sunsets and you look at it again, you could in 5 years get to the end of the policy book and have everything revised without it having been, an enormous upfront burden of trying to reinvent this wheel. But I think that the core of it should still be more information from the administration first about how the policy is working and why it's being proposed, because we have had times where policies have been presented and we're reading it cold and don't really understand what was the purpose of it, what's the problem it's trying to solve. We might see other problems that it might create, but without that, it's hard to assess or provide meaningful input. But I still think fundamentally, given the policies, the types of things that this committee has been reviewing, they really are core policies that the board ultimately needs to ratify, whether that's reviewing them directly and commenting and approving them, or whether it's knowing that the administration is doing it and having a more supervisory role. But one way or another, it seems like the buck still stops with the board. The more efficient way to do that might be to front load some of that review process and documentation process on the administration to report back to the board what is actually happening on the ground and whether it's working.
It's interesting you say some of that. It reminds me very much of when I was a new school board member the first time. And this was in the late 70s and early 80s. And I was at the same time a new law student and a new lawyer. I had a different approach to things, and I did precisely what you're talking about, except not on a 5-year cycle, but did it on became a 1.5-year cycle, and went through the entire policy book, one section at a time, one chapter at a time, and had lots and lots of suggestions, many substantive, some grammatical and spelling, some just writing things in a better way. It was a good learning experience for me, and at the same time, it is, as I think about our policy book, I think it's an almost overwhelming task to try to do that. But
if I may, though, I'm sorry to interrupt, but not every policy is going to need to be changed. And so if the staff and administration look at it and say it's fine, those should sail right through. The time and effort should really be on the ones that are not working or that have some policy choice embedded in it.
I understand. Anything else on this? Anybody? All right. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Without objection, we're adjourned.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great, beautiful day.
Again,
Good
beautiful day.
discussion.
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Well, do we end up